15 miles east of Vitebsk, on a frozen supply road on the morning of 3rd February 1943, Sergeant Pavel Ivanovich Rudenko crouches in the bed of a GAZ-AA lorry, his bare fingers wrapped around the twin wooden grips of a DShK heavy machine gun. The cold has turned the metal white with frost. He can smell diesel fumes rising off the column ahead of him, hear the crunch of tire chains on packed snow, and feel the vibration of the idling engine through the soles of his felt boots. Behind him, in the truck bed, sit 4 wooden crates of belted 12.7mm ammunition, each cartridge as long as a man's middle finger. Rudenko has driven this stretch of road 11 times since December. He knows the tree line to the north, the burned-out kolkhoz barn at the halfway point, the bend where the road narrows to single file. What he does not know, on this particular morning, is that 3 kilometers ahead, a German reconnaissance patrol has already radioed word of Soviet vehicle movement back to a forward command post. Rudenko checks his watch. It reads 7:20. He signals to the driver. The column begins to move. To understand why a machine gun mounted on the back of a lorry mattered so much on this stretch of frozen road, one has to understand the scale of the problem the Red Army faced in keeping its armies supplied. By the winter of 1942 into 1943, Soviet forces had pushed the Wehrmacht back more than 100 kilometers in some sectors following the winter offensive. But every kilometer gained stretched the supply lines further and exposed them to greater danger. German rear area security units, roaming Luftwaffe, ground attack aircraft, and increasingly bold partisan bands all threatened the same narrow ribbons of road and rail that kept forward Soviet units fed, fueled, and armed. The Wehrmacht's own Junkers Ju-87 GAZ-AA fitted with underwing 37mm anti-tank cannon and the older Henschel H-123 biplane continued to inflict heavy losses on Soviet vehicles and armor even late into the war, diving out of low cloud with little warning. Against this threat, the standard Red Army infantry rifle was almost useless. What was needed was volume of fire, reach, and mobility all at once. The weapon the Soviets turned to was the DShK 1938, named for its designers, Vasily Degtyaryov and Georgy Shpagin, the latter better known for the iconic PPSH-41 submachine gun. Adopted formally in 1938 after the earlier, drum-fed DK model proved too slow and unreliable, the DShK fired the enormous 12.7 by 108mm cartridge at a rate of 600 rounds per minute with an effective range of roughly 2.5 kilometers, well over 1.5 miles. The gun itself weighed some 75 pounds, a little over 34 kilograms, air-cooled with a distinctive ribbed barrel, and fed from a belt rather than the clumsy drum of its predecessor. Around 8,000 to 9,000 DShK guns were manufactured during the war years, the overwhelming majority issued to Red Army anti-aircraft units, whilst its 138-pound tripod-mounted American cousin, the Browning M2, filled a broadly similar role for the Western Allies. The DShK's Soviet operators found that its true value on the Eastern Front lay not in static defense, but in mobility. That mobility came from the humble GAZ-AA, a Soviet-built lorry derived from an early 1930s Ford design, robust, simple to maintain, and available in enormous numbers. Engineers fitted single DShK mounts to the truck beds for close protection of individual vehicles, and, on more heavily defended convoys, triple mounts clustering 3 guns together on a single pintle, capable of throwing out 1,800 rounds a minute of heavy caliber fire into the sky or along the tree line. Later in the war, the same weapon found its way onto the cupolas of IS-2 heavy tanks and ISU-152 self-propelled guns. But it was on the back of a lorry rattling along a rutted supply road that the DShK first proved its worth protecting the columns that kept the Red Army moving forward. Along roads like the one east of Vitebsk, the threat rarely announced itself in the way training manuals suggested it should. Sometimes it came from the sky, a Stuka dropping out of grey cloud at 300 or 400 meters, cannon already firing. Sometimes it came from the tree line, where German security troops, or further behind the front, Soviet partisans operating against German convoys elsewhere on the same road network, had dug in with machine guns and mines. By early 1943, the so-called Vitebsk Gate, a stretch of thinly held ground between German army groups, had allowed Soviet-backed partisan formations to control as much as half of Belorussia, and German reinforcements moving up to the front frequently took their first casualties as much as 1,000 kilometers behind the actual fighting line. One German corporal, writing home during this period, described his motor column being halted 6 times by damaged bridges and 4 times by rifle and machine gun fire before it ever reached the front. The road between 2 towns cratered by guerrillas mere hours before his convoy arrived. This was the environment into which the DShK armed lorry was sent. Not a single dramatic battle, but a grinding, near-daily contest for control of the roads themselves. If this deep dive into history is interesting to you, consider subscribing. It helps far more than you might think. The tactical answer the Red Army settled on was straightforward in concept and demanding in execution. Rather than scattering machine guns thinly along the length of a column, commanders learned to cluster their DShK armed lorries at intervals, positioning triple mounts at the front, middle, and rear of a convoy so that overlapping fields of fire covered the entire length of the road. When contact came, from the air or from the tree line, the truck crews did not attempt to outrun the threat. Instead, drivers halted where the terrain allowed, and gunners opened up with sustained, disciplined bursts rather than a single panicked volley. A well-drilled triple mount, 3 guns firing in sequence rather than simultaneously to manage barrel heat and ammunition consumption, could put a wall of heavy-caliber fire across a tree line 400 meters wide within seconds, enough to force an ambushing party to keep their heads down rather than aim, and enough to make a strafing pilot break off his run early rather than press home a second pass. Against light vehicles, half-tracks, and unarmored personnel carriers, a single hit from a 12.7mm round was frequently catastrophic. Against dug-in infantry, the sheer volume and reach of fire, extending well beyond that of a standard machine gun, allowed a handful of truck-mounted guns to hold open ground that infantry alone could not have contested. The effect on both sides of the front was cumulative rather than instantaneous. For the Wehrmacht security units and reconnaissance patrols tasked with interdicting Soviet supply columns, the presence of DShK mounts changed the arithmetic of every ambush. A patrol that might comfortably shoot up an unescorted column of unarmed lorries had to think twice when the same road might carry a convoy bristling with heavy machine guns capable of shredding cover at a range their own MG-34s could not match. German after-action reports from the period increasingly noted the need for larger forces, artillery support, or air cover simply to interdict what had once been considered soft targets. For Soviet drivers and gunners like Rudenko, the calculation was equally stark. A convoy without adequate DShK coverage risked total loss, whilst one properly escorted might take casualties but would very likely get its cargo through. Neither side found a permanent solution. What emerged instead was a running adaptation. Ambush met by escort, escort met by heavier ambush, each side adjusting through the winter and into the spring campaigning season. Complications multiplied as the tactic spread. Ammunition supply for the DShK's 12.7mm round could not always keep pace with demand, particularly on the most heavily contested routes where a single sustained engagement might exhaust an entire truck's reserve of 4 ammunition crates within minutes. Mechanical reliability suffered in the extreme cold. Crews learned to keep the guns wrapped and, where possible, to fire short test bursts before a convoy set out, simply to confirm the action and not frozen solid overnight. The trucks themselves were vulnerable, unarmored, and a well-placed mine or a lucky cannon round from a Stuka could disable a gun lorry as easily as any other vehicle in the column, at which point the gap in the defensive screen had to be filled immediately or the whole formation risked exposure. Partisan liaison added a further layer of complexity. Soviet forces operating openly along a road and partisan bands operating covertly in the same district sometimes had to coordinate, however loosely, to avoid duplicating effort or worse, mistaking each other for the enemy in poor visibility. What became clear over the course of that winter, and it is visible in the way both Soviet convoy doctrine and German security tactics evolved through 1943, was that mobile heavy firepower had permanently altered the balance on the Eastern Front's secondary roads. Soviet transport officers began requesting DShK armed escort as standard for any convoy of a certain size, rather than as an occasional reinforcement. German commanders responded by shifting from small opportunistic ambush parties towards larger, better supported interdiction operations, an implicit admission that the old low-risk tactics no longer worked against escorted columns. The operations later grouped under the name Rail War, launched in June 1943 by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Belarusia and organized in part by the demolition specialist Ilya Starinov, would go on to target German rail lines directly rather than roads, in some measure because road-based interdiction against DShK escorted convoys had grown costlier than it once was. In the weeks that followed engagements like the one on the road east of Vitebsk, the pattern repeated itself along dozens of similar routes across the front, from the approaches to Smolensk, down through the Bryansk forest region, and into the Ukrainian sectors where partisan commanders such as Sidor Kovpak operated. Soviet logistics, never abundant, became measurably more reliable on roads where DShK escort was consistently available, a fact reflected in the growing Red Army practice of allocating triple-mounted lorries to convoy duty as a matter of course rather than exception. The wider legacy reached beyond the war itself. The DShK, and later its improved post-war variant, the DShK 1938/46, remained in Soviet and Allied service for decades, exported and license-built across the Eastern Bloc in China, Pakistan, and Romania, amongst others, its combination of range, punch, and mountability making it as relevant to Cold War-era irregular conflicts as it had been to the muddy, frozen roads of Belarusia. Rudenko's convoy reaches its depot at 4:30 that afternoon, the light already failing over the snow. He has fired perhaps 200 rounds since morning, enough to blacken his gloves with propellant residue and leave his ears ringing beneath his cap. 2 lorries in the column bear fresh scars along their canvas covers. None has been lost. As he climbs down from the truck bed, stiff with cold, he does not think of himself as part of a turning point in the history of a road network, only of the ammunition crates that need refilling before tomorrow's run. But the road he drove that day would carry Soviet supplies again the next morning, and the morning after that. Precisely because men like him, and guns like the one now silent and frosted over in the gathering dark, had made that road too costly for the enemy to close.